All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome again to another episode of the Ken Wilber Show. I am here with the man himself, Mr. Ken Wilber. Ken, how you doing, man?
Good, Betty.
Good. I think today's going to be a great show. We've got some really cool questions in store for you. And yeah, I really can't wait to see how you respond to these. I mean, these are questions that I myself have been thinking about a lot lately. Particularly after the last couple episodes that we've done. You know, our first episode together was sort of about the political quagmire that we find ourselves in. The second episode was, you know, sort of trying to track, okay, well, what brought us to this point in the first place? We talked about social media and we talked about postmodern excesses and all of that. Today's show, I think we're going to be talking about something that, at least to me, really represents sort of a remedy for a lot of the challenges that we're going through politically, culturally, socially, geopolitically. And that's basically integral thinking. And in my, the first question I have for you today, I often differentiate integral thought from integral thinking. In other words, integral thought, it's almost like integral is a noun. You know what I mean? Integral thought is the products of integral thinking. It's what we've spent years exploring here on the website: quadrants, levels, lines, states, types, the entire integral map. Whereas integral thinking, this is actually talking about the sort of thinking, the type of thinking that allows people like you to produce things like integral maps in the first place. So I was thinking today, one of the things we would talk about are some of the major qualities of integral thinking, particularly at the vision logic or construct aware stages of development. What are some of the markers of a healthy cognitive posture that should be taken by integral thinkers? And I think this is really important, Ken, too, because, you know, as we've talked about a lot over the years, there's a lot of different ways to enact integral, right? I mean, in integral, we've got a lot of people who are really into integral and have been studying integral for years, who are, you know, nonetheless still cognitively orange or cognitively green, cognitively teal, turquoise, and all of those are going to actually express and enact this big, beautiful vision in sort of some different ways. So I thought it'd be helpful for us to, you know, basically point to a couple road signs. So, you know, it seems to me that some of these qualities, at minimum, would include things like, you know, having a both and mindset instead of an either or mindset. There's a capacity that comes online to hold paradox and deep nuance, rather than sort of simplifying things, oversimplifying things. There's a natural empathy that comes online that comes from a fluency with perspective taking. I think there's a recognition of some of the differences and relationships between things like mind and consciousness and spirituality. I think a lot of these, you know, we start discerning a lot of what those terms actually mean in our kind of moment-to-moment experience. There's a striving to find, you know, what's often called the third win at every opportunity. So I win, you win, and sort of the total evolutionary system that we're a part of also wins. And there's also a sense of optimism, I think, that really comes from somewhere beyond our own frame of reference. So it's an optimism that sort of transcends sort of the, you know, where we're at and what we're struggling with and what we're challenged by. It's an optimism that is almost a more, you know, I think of it almost like an integral mind starts to see things almost like a geologist see things, and you start looking at the world in terms of like 5,000 year chunks rather than, you know, 5-minute chunks.
Right.
So that was the first part of the question. And then there's a second part too, which I can just read right now, or we can save it. However you want to go.
Your call.
Okay. Well, why don't I just get it all out, and then you can get it all out, and then we can have a little bit of back and forth.
Okay.
So, second, when it comes to the principle, so the first part was about the qualities of integral thought and sort of the cognitive postures that we can take. The second is the principles of integral thinking. And when I try to think about, you know, what are sort of the bedrock principles that we can use, I always go to 3 terms that you first introduced in one of your excerpts from the second book in your Cosmos trilogy, which was titled The Many Ways We Touch. And those terms are non-exclusion, enfoldment, and enactment. And those are, you know, those are heavy lifting words for sure. A simpler version of that might be something like everyone is right. That's kind of the main idea behind non-exclusion. Some are more right than others, true but partial. That describes the unfoldment process. And then if you want to know this, do that, which is enactment. And these terms, you know, they came about while you were putting together your integral methodological pluralism framework, which, for those who don't know, is a robust meta-paradigmatic scaffolding that seeks to honor, include, and integrate multiple paradigms and methodologies and practices across all domains of human knowing. As you say in the many ways we touch, these three regulative principles, non-exclusion, unfoldment, enactment, these are principles that were reverse engineered, if you will, from the fact that numerous different and seemingly conflicting paradigms are already being competently practiced all over the world. And thus the question is not, and never has been, which is right and which is wrong, but rather how can all of them already be arising in a cosmos? Or if you put differently, what is the shape of the universe in which all of this is somehow true? And although these principles are really intended to help thought leaders, and so forth, make their particular fields of knowledge more expansive, more comprehensive, more complete, I personally think they can be taken more generally by the rest of us as basically three essential qualities of the integral mind. And these can be used as, kind of an ongoing heuristic micro practice to help us see more fully, communicate more skillfully, and discover the most effective solutions to whatever problems we happen to be facing. So maybe we could take a quick look at each of these principles, how they can be used as cognitive guardrails while navigating the incredible complexity of our lives and the world around us. And then finally, I'm curious whether you think integral thinking can itself be somehow systematized into a teachable process, kind of like critical thinking, and whether you think these principles might actually represent the core of that process, and finally, whether that process itself, whether you think that process could actually help accelerate people's growth into these integral stages of development, whether it can actually help people in that growing up process. So that was a lot. And I'm curious to see how you take this on.
Okay. Let me, jotting down some notes here. What you're talking about when you're talking about the qualities of integral thinking is more not just what you're looking at, but how you're looking at it.
Mm-hmm.
And the how is not as often given as much attention as the what.
Right.
And in part, it's because things like scientific materialism make up their mind about how, this is the one true way to look. And then they just spend their time examining what's, various, study bacteria, study planets, study geology, and so on, all using the same how, and just trying to come up with different what's. But once you start looking at the how, once you start looking at the quality of thinking itself, what's going into that, one of the first things you find is that you're dealing with perspectives. Mm-hmm. And perspectives are really rather extraordinary things because they reflect the fact that every holon in existence occupies a different space. And therefore, if nothing else, it sees the world from a different angle than every other holon.
Right.
So there are different perspectives inherent in everything that exists. And taking those perspectives into account can be extraordinarily important. And particularly if we track evolution and see various holons becoming more and more complex. So if you have like atoms, and then whatever the atom's perspective is, atoms are taken up into molecules. So now we have a molecular perspective on reality, but it's including atomic perspective. So those are still there. And then molecules are taken up into cells. Cells have a perspective on reality, but they're still included in the molecular perspective, which includes the atomic perspective. So this starts to get as richly diverse. The how you're looking is as richly diverse as the what that you're looking at. So it actually turns out that at least some developmental psychologists actually define a major stage of development as adding a new and major perspective.
Mm-hmm.
So Levenger does this, for example. Suzanne Kuckreiter does this. And you can see various very bright people based on their research who are doing this. So, for example, in a Levenger type of system, you start out and the young infant and child can only take first-person perspective. And so that's essentially magenta and red. That's the perspective that they have. As growth and development continues, the young child learns to actually take the role of other. Mm-hmm. So it can actually start to see the world through another person's eyes. So it adds a second person perspective, and that actually moves it up into an identity where it can start to identify with second person groups. So instead of just identifying with their own I space, they can start to identify with a we space. And it might be they're identified with their family, their clan, or their tribe, or even more mature, their nation, even all members of their religion. But they move from an egocentric into ethnocentric stances of identity. As growth continues, they add a third person perspective. That turns out to be, in Piaget's system, for example, formal operational cognition. And so that third person perspective can actually see universal systems. You can't see these from just first or second person. So this different perspective is actually bringing forth a different reality. Mm-hmm. And that's a really crucial point about perspectives. And this is part of the principle of enactment, that different perspectives actually co-create the phenomena that they're aware of. That mm-hmm. phenomena aren't just given, and then you have these different levels of interpreting this one single given phenomena.
Right.
It's one of the primary things you learn from developmental studies is every major level sees a different world. And that, for people who are studying epistemology and ontology, the people that don't take that into account, like most forms of realism, are missing a major point about reality. So somebody who's just a pure realist thinks it's just the objects that they're aware of. That's the one real reality. And you can interpret it differently. There's really only one right way to interpret that because it's just one given material, sensorimotor, objective reality, and that's what they're aware of. And that's, according to every developmental model in the world, that's massively wrong. That's not how it works. So you can keep adding. Orange modern systems can take this third person perspective. That's why when historically human beings started to do that, we actually started to get the rise of virtually all of the modern sciences, because those were taking a third person, hypothetical, deductive, systemic view of reality. We hadn't done that before. So we really didn't have those kinds of sciences before. Also taking a third person world-centric perspective meant that literally for the first time, we weren't just thinking about the rights or the morals of an individual group. In other words, if you're a Christian, then you have certain rights. If you're not a Christian, then you don't have those rights. So if you accept Jesus Christ as your personal savior and you're a fundamentalist Christian, then you get to go to heaven. A Hindu doesn't go to heaven. For a fundamentalist Christian, Hindus in heaven just don't work. They just can't picture that. That's not going to work. So it was only, so through all of those stages of our historical development, essentially the first 300,000 years we were on the planet, we still had slavery.
Right.
Every modern religion, major religion, not modern, every major mythic religion had slavery. Buddhist monasteries had slaves, Christian monasteries had slaves. It was so widespread, I pointed this out before, but it's just astonishing. The American Indians took their slaves with them on the Trail of Tears,
Right.
for heaven's sakes. And so only in around a 100-year period from around 1770 to 1870, slavery was outlawed in every single rational industrial nation on the face of the planet, because they were operating from third person universal morals, not just what's right if you're a Catholic or what's right if you're a Frenchman, but what's right if you're a human being.
Mm-hmm.
So we went from rights in here in particular tribes to what all tribes have in common, and that's humanity. And so rights belong to humans. These are universal rights that all people have. That was a staggering change.
And I've always loved, Ken, how that was described. It was described as we find these truths to be self-evident, but they're only self-evident at minimally an orange stage of development.
Well, exactly. And even though, I mean, what happened at the time is that these principles of universal rights for all people, it was still, the cultures at that time were still ethnocentric.
Right.
So there was still a dominant culture in Europe, for example. Yes, it was white, European, male, able-bodied, usually propertied. And universal rights were eventually applied to just that tribe.
Mm-hmm.
So we would say, you know, we hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal. That just didn't happen to include black men or women or, you know, but the principles were coming from Orange.
Right.
And that meant those principles kept being applied and kept being applied. And so more tribes and more tribes and more tribes were brought into the tent of universal care. And so that was what blacks got rights, women got the vote, LGBTQ got marriage rights. Now we're looking at transgender rights. I mean, it kept expanding. Those original Orange principles kept expanding. More and more tribes included, because it was focused on what all tribes have in common.
Right.
Not what just makes your tribe special.
Right.
Not just you're male, so you get this right. You're female, you don't get it. So you can keep adding perspectives. By the time we get to the 60s and green, postmodern comes in, it has a fourth person perspective capacity. And in the simplest terms, that just means it can reflect on the previous third person systems. And so where Orange would come up with universal systems, like there wasn't just Hindu chemistry and Jewish chemistry, there was just chemistry.
Right.
Universal chemistry. What Green started to do is reflect on all of those single universal systems. And because it had an increased capacity for differentiation, it started to differentiate them all. And it said, okay, wait a minute, there isn't just one culture that's true and everybody else is wrong. It's that by differentiating these single systems, it came up with a multicultural view where all cultures are equal We can't say that one is superior, one is better, anything like that. So this multicultural egalitarianism, it became the value that Green most promoted.
Mhm.
Now, in a certain sense, that's absolutely fine, and it was a step forward. But what Green could do is that although it could differentiate these systems, it didn't yet have the cognitive power to integrate them.
Right.
And so it could show how they're all different and they're all important and all the tribes, you know, should get an equal value, but it couldn't bring them together. It couldn't actually integrate them into an all-inclusive framework.
Mm-hmm.
And so it just left these things to go in their own separate ways. And this eventually ended up leading directly into a culture wars.
Right.
Because everybody retribalized.
Right.
We just worked our way in to treating all tribes fairly, regardless of race, color, sex, or creed. Now, all of a sudden, we've retribalized, and you only focus on your sex. You only focus on your race. You only focus on your gender. You only focus on your creed. And that's what's important. So all of a sudden, you're no longer emphasizing what you have in common with other tribes anymore. It's just you are a tribe. And it's that tribe versus this tribe versus this tribe versus this tribe. And that's the culture wars. And without finding a way to bring those together, then the fragmentation, the friction, the anger, the aggression just continues to increase. So what we find as we move into second tier, into the first stages there, teal, then what you see is the capacity to integrate differentiations emerges. And in some ways, for the first time in history. And that's why Claire Graves called it cataclysmic and a monumental leap in meaning. Because all of a sudden, it did do that. Yes, we can differentiate all of these diversities and all these multicultural, tribal groups, all of which have value, all of which are important. But now you can hold it in a unified framework. You can actually find ways that they all fit together. And the reason that they all deserve rights is not because just one tribe gets rights and these tribes get rights, but because all tribes sharing that unified human reality, that's why they all get equal rights, because they're all equally part of this common humanity. And without that, it's just tribal warfare.
Right.
So you add a fifth person perspective. And in Commons and Richard's research on higher cognitive stages, they found 4 major stages, and these actually apply to orange, green, teal, and turquoise. So orange is the one that could first see through third person perspective universal systems. And so Commons and Richard just called this stage systemic. Mm-hmm. And then we saw green adds a 4th person that can reflect on systems. And so it can differentiate them and end up with a multicultural egalitarianism. Commons and Richards called that meta-systemic, because they're looking at systemic. But they couldn't bring these meta-systemic fragments together. When you get to teal, that's what teal can start to do. Right. It looks at all these different fragments and binds many of them together into unified frameworks that fully acknowledge and honor the differentiations, but also unify them in a broader context, in a broader framework. And so they can actually start to create things that might be called, for example, paradigms, which take a lot of different things, work them into broad, large disciplines. Mm-hmm. Commons and Richards call that stage paradigmatic. And then when you get to turquoise, turquoise looks at all these paradigms that teal has created and all the unity in diversities that it's introduced. And then turquoise says, okay, now how do all of those paradigms fit together? And so that's the highest stage that Commons and Richards recognize. It's sort of the highest stage that orthodox developmentalists recognize. But we, of course, in integral meta theory, we tentatively recognize third tier stages. And these are 3 or 4 even higher stages that we have some type of evidence that they exist. They just happen to be very rare right now. But as evolution continues, we expect to see more and more people moving into those. So the point here is that each of these perspectives is seeing a different world.
Right.
And again, it's not just that there's a single material pre-given world, and each stage looks at that same one world and interprets it differently.
Mm-hmm.
It's that with each major level of development, the injunctions, the actions, the paradigms at that level enact and bring forth different phenomena. Now, they're not just creating them. There are realities there, but they're being brought forth and enacted by these different perspectives.
Right.
And these different perspectives are all forms of, if you want to know if it's raining outside, go to the window and look.
Right.
So a real paradigm is not, well, and we'll come back to this when we talk about the 3 principles of non-exclusion, enfoldment, enactment. But a paradigm isn't the way it was almost always misinterpreted, which was that it was some sort of big super theory that created facts. And so people using it this way would say there are like 3 or 4 big paradigm shifts in modern science. There was like the Copernican, and then Newtonian, and then Einsteinian, and those are the big paradigms. And now we're on a new paradigm that sees everything interwoven, and it's the same as the mystics and all that kind of stuff. That's not how Kuhn used it at all. And in his book on the structure of scientific revolutions, he didn't outline 3 or 4 revolutions or paradigms. He outlined hundreds.
Right.
And what each of those were was just an actual practice, something you actually did. It was a methodology. It was an injunction. He got so upset with the way paradigm was being used at large that he stopped using the term entirely. And he started using the term exemplar, which means exemplary injunction. Mm-hmm. So it's just a specific methodology that will bring forth a different set of data. It's enacting that data, not in just it's not just inventing the data. So people, again, misusing his concept, would say, therefore, progress in science is just completely random. There really isn't. It's just, you can choose any paradigm you want, and facts can't determine which is right and all that. Totally misusing it. Kuhn said, quote, "I, for one, am a staunch believer in scientific progress." So it's the fact that each of these major levels of development is in itself a series of injunctions or paradigms or exemplars that will co-create the phenomena at its level. Right. And so new realities are brought into being as we continue to grow and evolve.
So Ken, is it fair to say that each of these stages brings with it its own truths that become self-evident at that stage? So at red, you know, I find these truths to be self-evident. Corey is fucking awesome.
Absolutely.
Right? Amber, we find these truths to be self-evident. There is only one God.
That's right.
And then, you know, obviously orange, green, teal, turquoise, all of these have their own self-evident truths that come online and can be perceived for the first time at that stage, right, and which then becomes sort of like first principles for everything that emerges out of that stage.
That's right. And what we tend to end up doing is, when it comes to science, for example, well, first of all, science is just sort of the broad attempt to discover some sort of, quote, objective truth. You can see that each of the earlier stages, including magic and mythic, had their own forms of science. So mythic, for example, had alchemy, that at Orange would become chemistry. It had astrology, that at Orange would become astronomy. And it had humoral psychology and bile and phlegm and all that stuff. And that would become more like big five-factor psychology at Orange. So you can see that kind of stuff happening. And the way we tend to decide truth in science is the leading theory at the highest stage of development that's being engaged in that science. So if you just look at how atoms, or just the most fundamental particles of the universe, were looked at, when atoms were first discovered at Orange, people like Niels Bohr would actually picture atoms like little solar systems. And they actually thought they had like a sun that was the nucleus, and the atoms went around them just like planets, and those are actually, that's what it was like. That pretty soon, as green started to move in with its much more pluralistic, multiplicity kind of views, it discovered quarks. And quarks were just kind of all over the place. And in sort of perfect keeping with the green pluralistic relativistic stance, there was no real way that they could pull quarks together. But they were no longer looking at atoms as fundamental in little planetary solar systems. They were actually made of quarks in ways that weren't quite clear. But so we had that going on for a long time. And then as Thiel emerged in that field, a discovery of a framework that brought all those quarks together in a unified view became, is sometimes just called the Standard Model. That's just sort of the way that physics tended to take as truth at that point. And then as you got up into turquoise, it's kind of moved into extraordinarily complex things, but that are capable of integrating even more aspects of physics. And this was string theory and variations on that. That's become so complex that even advocates of string theory acknowledge that there's no empirical experiment that they can think of that would prove or disprove the existence of strings. It will never happen. And so now it's just become kind of a Pythagorean consistency model. And we used to say, okay, physics gives us, it's our hardest science, dealing with rocks and earth and all that. And now it's some sort of 11 dimensions in 500 universes, but they're all sort of unified, kind of somehow.
It's almost a weird return to a metaphysics.
Well,
almost.
In a strange way it is.
Yeah.
But what's interesting is folks like realists, again, would say, okay, well, there's just one reality there. And so we say, okay, well, which is it? Is it the orange view of just planetary atoms? Is it the green view of multiplicity of quarks? Is it a teal view of the Standard Model, eightfold way quarks? Is it turquoise? So which one is it? And the point, again, is simply that different levels of development unfold and enact different phenomena. And our best guess, the way we do science, is we go with not that we're aware of what we're doing, But in effect, what we do is end up taking the highest level of development we have and the theories that have the most acceptance at that point. And that's what we call the most fundamental realities that exist. And so we go back to something like tribal times 300,000-400,000 years ago. And I make a distinction, of course, between what subsists and what exists at any given stage.
Can you say more about that?
Atoms did not exist for any tribal member. There was nothing in a tribal awareness that included atoms. It just didn't exist for a human being in tribal times. But we don't say, therefore, there were no atoms.
Right.
So atoms were subsisting. They were there, but they hadn't come into awareness. They weren't brought forth to exist in human awareness. So they subsisted, they didn't exist. And by the way, this is one of the reasons, because of subsistence, that integral theory is not guilty of an epistemic fallacy. It doesn't do that. But it does point out, and this is simply the tricky part, when we say, okay, there was some sort of quantum level reality that subsisted 300,000 years ago with tribe. What was it? Was it planetary atoms? Was it quarks? Was it eightfold standard model? Or was it strings? And so what we take to be the real subsistence reality is determined by the interpretation of the highest level of development we're at.
Right.
So we see how they're tied in. You can't just separate them. You can't equate them, but you can't just totally separate them. So one of the things that you would be tracking, if you're tracking these different objects, atoms, quarks, strings, is you're also looking at the perspectives that brought those forth. And perspectives, my point so far is that perspectives include not just changing the scale of something, and that's largely how science looks at it. So we have sort of this meso realm where Newtonian physics still works. I mean, we put a person on the moon using just Newtonian physics, but then you can get either very small or very large dimensions. And then the physics changes in those dimensions, because again, those are different perspectives in terms of just size. And so at the very small, we have quantum events and things like Planck's constant and so on. And that tends to explain that, the micro dimension. And then at extremely large spaces, we get relativistic physics.
Right. Yep.
And the constant c, the speed of light, and that kind of thing. Okay. So that's one way to do dimensions. But another way is these dimensions of consciousness, levels of consciousness. Those are enacting, because of their different perspectives, they're enacting different dimensions in each case. And so, as I say, that's the first thing you learn with developmental studies, is that each level of development co-creates an ontologically different world. It's not subjective idealism. It's a true co-creation or enactment. Yep. So if you start with just a single given occurrence, or just a given happening, before it's labeled or conceptualized or busted up into anything, it's just a single event. Although even the word single doesn't really apply because you haven't started applying those conceptual differences. But what you can do is approach that happening, and you can look at it from a subjective stance and simply get your specific subjective responses, reactions, feelings, viewpoints, understandings, insights, whatever it might be, about that event. But then you can also attempt to stand back in a more objective stance. And again, assuming you're at orange or higher and you have these distinctions available. And those turn out to be two very important they're two very different perspectives, first person and third person. Mm-hmm. And so they're showing you different dimensions of that reality. And one of the first things that you learn, just from the principle of non-exclusion, for example, mm-hmm. is that each paradigm, each perspective is going to bring forth phenomena. And those phenomena just in themselves are real. You're not allowed to say those aren't real, because in themselves, they're existing. They are what they are. You can say, well, those aren't true if you make a judgment compared to some other scale. Mm-hmm. So if you have an image in your first person awareness of a unicorn, and you can say, well, you know, a realist would say, well, that's not real. That's not true. Well, what they mean is there isn't something out here in my dimension,
right,
that corresponds with that dimension.
Yep.
And I go, I don't give a shit. I'm not talking about your dimension.
Right.
I'm talking about this dimension.
Yep.
As an image, that image of the unicorn exists.
Yep.
Whether it corresponds to something out there or not doesn't matter at all.
Especially if you step into my 5-year-old daughter's perspective.
Oh,
she
absolutely.
knows they don't exist out there, but unicorns are real.
Absolutely. I mean, and one of the reasons that I can say things like, for example, everybody's right. Somebody should, okay, well, wait a minute. What about Santa Claus?
Right.
Now you go, well, okay.
Yep.
If you look at the actual mythic stage of development that works with concrete operational realities, so you tend to get what's called mythic literal phenomena. Mm-hmm. That stage will tend to produce Santa Claus. It'll produce Zeus. It'll produce Apollo. It'll produce Jehovah. It'll produce Apollo, and on and on. And those are real at that level of reality. Mm. And we can't just so quickly say, oh, but we know those are wrong. They're not wrong at that level. And humanity for thousands of years was at that level, producing those phenomena and worshiping them left and right.
Yep.
You can't just go into, by the way, that's all wrong.
Right.
No, it's not. It's right at that level. That's a real phenomena. It's a real reality. Now, what happens when you move up to higher level is that you add a perspective. So you can reflect on that. And you can then say, okay, there isn't actually a Santa Claus really flying around out there that's really going to come down your chimney. I understand how it's real for you, not denying that. But you can make that kind of judgment. Mm-hmm. But what you can't do is ever stop and say, okay, this is the only correct judgment.
Right.
Because 500 years from now, they'll look back on that judgment as absolutely idiotic as you're looking back on Santa Claus.
Right.
And so, I mean, 94% of the universe is dark matter. What the hell is that? That means all this stuff that we take as reality is only 6%?
Yep.
And that's just what we know, is that we don't know 94% of it. God knows how much we really don't know.
That's obvious where unicorns and Santa Claus live.
Well, it's, 500 years from now, 1,000 years from now, our views will look absolutely as ridiculous and pathetic as mythic and magic views do now. So everybody's right, and because you can situate them in a cosmic address where the phenomena they're seeing are real.
Mm-hmm.
And then within those domains, you can make judgments. And so within a mythic domain, you can make judgments about which God figures seem more important for you if you're at that stage. So you might find, for example, that Jehovah is more important to you than the tooth fairy. And that's a judgment you're making within that realm, and you're allowed to do that.
Yep.
Because the same paradigm, the same injunction is producing those. And so within that paradigm, you're allowed to make judgments. What you're not allowed to do is use a different paradigm to deny that paradigm altogether. That's not an exclusion. You're not allowed to do that. So that's the way, sort of all the way up. So you're looking, you start out with just this happening. And you realize you can look at it in a subjective fashion. And when you do that, it's going to, what you see is going to depend upon your level of consciousness in that subjective space.
Yep.
And that will differ. And each of those will have their own relative reality. But then you can also look at that same happening from an outside third person perspective. Now, when you do that, you see very different stuff. And in particular, if you look at holons, and one of the conclusions that looking at holons through all of these perspectives is that at the very least they have interior or left hand and they have exterior or right hand. Mm-hmm. And the exterior right hand is what you can see with a videotape or a camera or some sort of recording device. If you got a small enough video camera, you could take a picture of an atom. We can actually see electrons with an electron microscope, and molecules. We can actually see the outsides of them. We can't see the inside. So what's the inside? The inside is prehension. The inside is its own little bit of awareness, a little bit of proto-feeling, a little bit of proto-consciousness. And so that's what we have in the first person, subjective realities of that happening. And then if we look at it in an exterior fashion, we're going to see its matter, energy, and form. And those are just things that exist in the spatio-temporal world. Mm-hmm. What we can't see are interiors. The same way I can't actually see your interior, you can't see mine. But we have an enormous number of ways that we can give very compelling reasons that those exist. Mm-hmm. And among other things, that's what language does, is allows us to exchange perspectives. I take your perspective, you take mine, and we attempt to reach something called mutual understanding. Mm-hmm. And that can happen within a relatively similar ballpark. And so that's a very important reality.
It's miraculous. You've described it as the miracle of we. Because, you know, here we are, like I've got all my thoughts in my head. You've got all your thoughts in your head. There's this chasm between us, and yet we're able to fill the space with language.
Yeah, absolutely.
Shared meaning and shared values and all of that. And it really, it bridges these two sort of islands of consciousness and brings them together. It's miraculous.
Exactly. And in terms of, well, do we mean the same thing when we say something? People like Jürgen Habermas maintains that we all have the assumption that you can understand what I'm saying, or I wouldn't even try to talk to you.
Right.
if I was really convinced what the extreme postmodernists tell us, that we can't understand ever what the other person is saying, then why do they even talk? They wouldn't even talk if they believed that. It would be a complete waste of time. They just go in the corner and talk to themselves and jerk off. I mean, that sum total of their interesting life. So we're tracking these perspectives as part of what happens in your awareness as you're approaching a given happening. And so one of the things we're finding is that you can see these interior and exterior, and in those interiors, find levels of development. In those exteriors, you can also find evolutionary stages of unfolding. That's just one part of it, but that comes from seeing these different perspectives and the dimensions that they disclose. And of course, in looking at that single happening, and we've seen that it has a subjective and an objective dimension, then we can also look at it in terms of its own individual being, and then the types of groups or collectives that it's a part of. Because we just don't know really hardly any holons that exist just by themselves alone. And in things like evolution, you can't even get evolution going forward if you don't have both the interiors and the exteriors, but also individual and collective. So quick example, if you're looking at the evolution of a frog. So what did the first frog look like? And the answer that could actually live and exist. And the answer is, well, it wasn't a single frog. At the very least, there had to be a male frog and a female frog. And if there wasn't that, you got no frog. It's not going to exist beyond this little accidental showing up moment, and then it's gone. So there's actually a group of people. It's headed by a guy named Bruce Damer. And he's come out here and we've talked because they've kind of incorporated some integral ideas in what they're doing. And they're sort of on the very leading edge of creating, they're revisiting the whole notion about what did the original cell look like? What did life look like when it first started? And it's called abiogenesis, and they're working on that. And what we did through some extensive exchange between myself and Bruce was talk about how you just really you shouldn't be looking at just what the first individual was like. You needed to look at really all four quadrants. They all showed up at the same time. And so that's what you have to look at. And they agreed, and they actually created this sort of one of the original forms they're working with now is called a progenote. And it actually has sort of individual cell and community cells all wrapped together. It's like, and then the quadrants will differentiate out of that together. And one of the things that I really love is that, I mean, I'm always getting criticized by extremely conventional evolutionary theorists like Frank Visser, because I postulate eros, or an inherent novelty in the cosmos, which, by the way, is Whitehead's point. His three principles of all reality. Principle number one was the one. Principle two was the many. And the third principle he called the creative advance into novelty. Eros. Stuart Kaufman, self-organization is built into the universe. Eros. Ilya Prigogine, Nobel Prize winner. Order out of chaos. Even insentient matter, when pushed far from equilibrium, jumps into a higher level of order, eros. So I'm tired of these people saying that doesn't have any. But what I love about Bruce's work is they can, I love this term, it's so clunky. They say, now right at the beginning of this whole process is what we call the anti-probability machine. And that's what gets it started.
Right out of Douglas Adams.
Yeah, it's a jump into something improbable. But
Right.
that's the inherent beginning of it. It's not some accident or something. It's what's built in to the universe. And I love that. There's this inherent improbability machine.
It's fantastic.
Is at the beginning of all this. Absolutely fantastic. But so we're looking at these unfolding, evolutionary unfoldings, and we're seeing that you can look at them again through perspectives that include interior, exterior, individual, collective. Those turn out to be the foundations of first, second, third person pronouns in languages.
Mm-hmm.
And every major mature language has all three of those, because as language was evolving, it was running into all three of those dimensions: first person, second person, third person. And it had to evolve to fit those realities. And so every language has those perspectives built into it. And that should tell us something right there.
Mm-hmm.
Though what it's also telling us is that the upper left subjective I space and the lower left collective we space and the upper right he, him, her, it space and the lower right they, them, theirs, its space are real realities. Mm-hmm. And each of these have different types of truths. They have different types of meanings and drives and motivations. They have different value systems. And so, and each of those have levels of evolutionary unfolding, and each of those have lines. So even in evolutionary biology, they distinguish between what they call a grade, which is a level of development, and a clade, which is a line of development. And these are all real in all four quadrants. You can keep going. And this is again, just as we're changing our awareness, as we're changing our perspectives, those are all the things that we see. We wouldn't see those if we weren't changing our perspectives.
Right.
Those just aren't lying around out there waiting for everybody to see. That's why no tribe saw atoms. That's why no world religions have an understanding of stages of growing up. You actually, like Kuhn, you need a paradigm to generate specific truths. Mm-hmm. No paradigm, no truth.
Right.
All you get without any extra paradigm is just what you get in your average everyday awareness. Right. And average everyday awareness, I put it the other way. I'd say 99.99% of the things that humans call true doesn't exist in your ordinary awareness. If you just look at your ordinary awareness, the sun circles the earth.
Right.
The earth is flat. That, well, I could go on.
Yeah.
Not a lot of truth running around out there. So the paradigm is you have to do something to see these other things.
Yep.
Make a microscope, make a telescope, change your perspectives, look at levels of development. I mean, so perspectives are giving you these different objects. And we can't just start by trying to spot objects, because as long as we're stuck in a particular perspective, we'll only see the particular objects that are enacted by that perspective. Mm-hmm. There may be 100 other important perspectives that we're aware of, and therefore you're missing 99 of the other objects that are out there because you're not changing that. And you can keep repeating those perspectives. So we said you could start looking at just a single event, and you could look at it in a first person or a third person perspective. And that gives you 4 quadrants.
Mm-hmm.
You can look at any holon in any quadrant and repeat the same perspectives. So you can look at a holon in the upper left from the subjective point of view or from an objective point of view. And then you get 8 zones. And each of those zones have a different methodology because they're dealing with different data, different phenomena, different realities. And so that becomes absolutely crucial in terms of what's real. When we look at just these 8 zones, we find 8 methodologies, all of which are well known, well established by the people using them, that all of them have knowledge communities that have an enormous amount of compelling evidence that that's real. They have data backing it up. And yet almost every other methodology will deny their reality. That's just the worst way you can approach almost anything you can think of in this world. It's the worst way to build a philosophy. It's the worst way to build a political system. It's the worst way to build any society. It's the worst way to have a relationship. It's the worst way to find a job. Because all it's doing is saying, let me be blind to as many possible realities as I can be, because that'll make life easier for me. And I go, really? Good luck with that one. So, so what we have, just from looking at those perspectives, is we find out that any experience we have, any knowledge that we have, has a who and a how producing an object.
Mm-hmm.
So it has an epistemology, and those exist in the levels of consciousness. You have a different epistemology at each one, whether it's magic or mythic or rational or pluralistic or integral. And then you have methodologies, which especially come from these zones. So there are different things you do to help enact the phenomena in those zones. And then the who, the how generates different whats. Mm-hmm. So epistemologies, multiple methodologies, multiple ontologies. And these are all real, and they all fit together in an integrative meta-theoretical framework that we call integral. So those are some aspects of the thinking side of what we see. And then, of course, what we do tend to do is focus on the products and say, okay, you know, let's look at quadrants, let's look at levels, let's look at lines, let's look at states, let's look at types. And of course, that's important. But these are some of the ways that we discovered those in the first place.
That's right.
Because the whole point is that all of them are data that require specific paradigms to enact. And without those paradigms, you don't see it. They're not lying around out there waiting for everybody to see. Right. We've already seen lying around out there waiting for everybody to see is a flat earth and sun going around it. Not very good. And one way to talk about that is that we have at least these first, second, third person perspectives. And we've seen we can run them out to a fourth person, fifth person. But at least we have sort of 1, 2, 3 P, first, second, third person perspectives. And you can keep just reflecting those a numerous number of times. So the who, epistemology, how, methodology, what, ontology, that's a 1, 2, 3 of a 1, 2, 3 of a 1, 2, 3.
Right.
And you can keep doing that.
Right.
But you at least do that and you get this whole levels of epistemology, 8 zones of methodology, and an integral pluralistic ontology coming from all of that. And that's what we get if we just track what we're doing in our own awareness.
Right.
So that's where all of those products can come from.